The Presidential Guard has deployed at least a dozen tanks around the Presidential Palace, just a few miles from here where I'm standing in Tahrir Square. And there are reports that marches are being planned to go out of protesters who are against Mohamed Morsi, his constitutional decree, and his past actions, heading to the Presidential Palace, despite a statement by the Presidential Guard to clear the area and not allow protesters there. What happened last night was really a major escalation in this crisis that began 2 weeks ago with Mohamed Morsi's constitutional decree. We saw thousands and thousands of Muslim Brotherhood members and their allies in the ultra-conservative Salafi groups descend on the Presidential Palace, where there were a few hundred anti-Morsi protesters had set up a sit-in. I spoke to many people who were there when the Brotherhood came. They said they came in very hard, tore down the tents, kicked people out, attacked several people and beat them. And the response to that was, of course, people coming to the Presidential Palace, and this escalated into massive clashes that lasted for hours, with rocks, with Molotov cocktails. You could hear the sound of shotguns or some kind of fire happening. I saw injuries of people injured with birdshot. And as it stands, as you mentioned, 6 people were killed. Over 670 have been injured, and many are laying the blame for this violence at the foot of President Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. What we've seen since this declaration came down on November 22nd by Mohamed Morsi, which granted him wide-sweeping and unchecked authorities and put him beyond the reach of the judiciary, has been only an escalation in the political crisis, a deepening of the political cleavages, and that has manifested itself so violently on the streets of Cairo now. The Brotherhood, in the wake of this declaration by Morsi, we saw some of the biggest protests on the streets of Cairo, here in Tahrir Square behind me, and the response by Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, the group that he hails from, was to double down on their strategy and to force the transition. And they called the Constituent Assembly, which is drafting the country's constitution, called for a hastily called vote where they passed in a 17-hour session the constitution for the country in a very self-congratulatory tone, passing in near unanimity most of the amendments. That text has come under criticism from rights activists, rights advocates and others for being restrictive of certain rights. But it was really the process by which it was done. It reminded many people of the Mubarak era, this tactic of ramming through legislation. And the response by the opposition was to escalate their protests. And on Tuesday, we saw really an unprecedented march to the Presidential Palace, where tens of thousands of protesters descended on the Presidential Palace, really the biggest of its kind, to reach the palace walls. There were police there who had set up barricades, blocking people from reaching the Presidential Palace, but they fired some tear gas. There were some very brief clashes, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer size of the protests, and they surrounded the presidential walls, chanting against Morsi. The chants have become, have escalated as well, calling for Morsi to step down, calling for the people demand the fall of the regime, the same kind of language we heard in the 18 days that ousted Hosni Mubarak. They sprayed graffiti all around the walls of the Presidential Palace, mocking the president. And Morsi was forced to leave. He left in his motorcade, surrounded by security. And as we mentioned, a few hundred, protesters stayed the next day and had this sit-in. When the Brotherhood announced that they were going to hold a protest at the Presidential Palace, the prospect of violence was very high, and many people are blaming the Muslim Brotherhood for calling for a protest at the palace at the same time their opponents are there at this very, very tense moment, and using very aggressive language. The Brotherhood spokesperson, Mahmoud Ghazlan, he called for the demonstration to protect the legitimacy after the brute infringements by a group that that he said thought it could shake legitimacy or oppose its opinions by force. And then we saw Assam al-Arian, a leader in the Freedom and Justice Party and the Muslim Brotherhood, saying that these weren't clashes between supporters and opponents of the president, but there were really skirmishes between what he called the guardians of legitimacy and the revolution against counter-revolutionary attempts to topple legitimacy. So, this kind of language and this kind of behavior resulted in these massive clashes right now. People are heading to the presidential palace again. It's unclear where this is all going, but the political crisis that Egypt finds itself in is among the most severe and the deepest since this revolution began.